Cell injury is the sequence of events that follows when the magnitude of a stress or injurious stimuli is beyond the adaptive limits of the cell. There are various causes of cell injury, including hypoxia. So, when we are talking about hypoxia, there are different things that can cause hypoxia, like cardiac diseases, pulmonary diseases, reduced oxygen carrying capacity, like anemia, CO poisoning, right? Carbon monoxide poisoning, and ischemia. So, ischemia is one of the prominent causes of hypoxia. Physical agents or physical factors can lead to cell injury, like trauma, extremes of temperature, like heat or burns, uh, cold, extremes of cold temperatures, radiation, changes in atmospheric pressure, electrical shock. These are physical factors that can cause cell injury. Chemicals like therapeutic drugs, illicit drugs, or recreational drugs can cause cell injury. Immunologic factors like hypersensitivity reactions, autoimmune diseases, or reactions can cause uh, cell injury. Nutritional factors like overnutrition, so obesity, for example, right, can cause cell injury. You've heard of things like um, hypervitaminosis, right? Overnutrition, undernutrition, like nutritional deficiencies, protein energy malnutrition can cause cell injury. Genetic factors like Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, sickle cell anemia. These are genetic factors that can cause cell injury. There are two types of cell injury: the reversible and irreversible cell injury. How does this etiologic agent cause cell injury? The common way that etiologic factors will cause cell injury is by causing impaired ADP synthesis. Impaired ADP synthesis would eventually lead to impaired sodium potassium ATPase pump activity, or energy dependent ion pump activity. So sodium potassium ATPase pump, calcium pump activity is impaired as a result of impaired ADP synthesis, and that will lead to accumulation of sodium and potassium, sodium and water, right? That will make the cell to swell. Yeah. But in addition to that, accumulation of calcium will lead to activation of intracellular enzymes that can lead to injury to the cells. Also, in conditions like hypoxia, where there is impaired aerobic activity or impaired aerobic or mostly anaerobic activity, which will lead to mostly anaerobic glycolysis, there is increased synthesis of lactic acid, and this will lead to decreased intracellular pH, and, uh, and this can eventually lead to clumping of the chromatin. Also, deficiency of ATP would lead to dissociation of the ribosomes from the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that will lead to impaired protein synthesis. Let's look at the features of reversible and irreversible cell injury. What are the features that you find in these cells in reversible cell injury? There is mostly swelling of the cells and the organelles. Just imagine that you have a balloon and you're filling it with water. What is going to happen? It gets bigger and bigger. So that is what is going on in this cell. They are accumulating water because of sodium accumulation, right? So water follows, and so the cell gets bigger and bigger. Eventually, the modifications that you find in this cell membrane, like the microvilli, will be lost. Just imagine you keep filling this balloon with water. You just keep filling, 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 and eventually there is weak areas, bulging weak areas within the wall, this plasma membrane. And we refer to these bulging areas as the blebs. So there is loss of modification so the cell swells, irreversible cell injury. The cell swells, the organelles will swell, and then there is loss of the modifications of this plasma membrane, like the microvilli, and then there's formation of blebs. In addition to that, we already talked about there is dissociation of the polysomes, right? And also there is dissociation of the ribosomes from the rough endoplasmic reticulum. In the mitochondria, there is accumulation of small amorphous densities. Eventually, if this injurious stimuli persist, or if this stressful agent persists, or if the magnitude of the stress is beyond just being able to cause a reversible cell injury, it will become an irreversible cell injury. And in irreversible cell injury, what do you find in the cell? We are going to look at the findings in irreversible cell injury. First, the cell has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and at this point, there is rupture of the cell membrane. So there's rupture of the plasma membrane and the organellar membrane. What are the implications of this rupture or severe injury of this cell membrane? For the lysosome, for example, the release of the lysosomal contents like the endonucleases and proteases will lead to digestion of the content of the cell, like the protein and the endonuclease, DNA and RNA within the cell, and this can lead to the death of the cell. The leakage of cytochrome C from the mitochondria into the cytosol will lead to activation of caspases, and this can lead to the death of the cell. Also, the rupture of the plasma membrane will lead to leakage of content or loss of content of the cell to the extracellular space. So when we are talking about content of the cell, we are looking at things like ATP, in addition to other things like the electrolytes within the cell. Loss of ATP to the extracellular space will further lead to depletion of intracellular ATP. Now, following the depletion of this intracellular ATP, right, the whole condition of the cell, the injury to the cell will worsen. But in addition to this, there is influx of extracellular electrolytes, all right? So electrolytes that are high within the extracellular space like calcium will get into the cell and activate enzymes like the ATPase, and that will lead to breakdown of ATP, right? Phospholipases, which will lead to breakdown of the cell membrane, right? So that would worsen the injury to the cell membrane, right? Activation of endonucleases, that will lead to digestion of DNA and RNA within the cell, and then activation of proteases, and that will lead to digestion of or breakdown of protein within the cell, and that would worsen the cell injury. So eventually, the cell will die by apoptosis or necrosis. That brings us to the end of our discussion for part 1, and in the next video we're going to be talking about part 2 of cell injury. Thank you.